This is TWiT.
This episode of Tech Break is brought to you by our friends at IT Pro TV, now called ACI Learning. Provide more support for MSP teams by keeping their skills up to date in all aspects of IT, including MS Cloud, AWS, CompTIA, and so much more. TWiT listeners can receive up to 65% off an IT Pro Enterprise Solution Plan. The discount is based on the size of your team when you fill out their form.
You may have asked for AI regulation. Maybe you didn't, but if you did, you got it, at least sort of, about as close to AI regulation here in the U.S. as we've gotten so far. President Biden issued a pretty big executive order on artificial intelligence. It aims to address many of the risks. Well, hopefully, I think still, encouraging some sort of innovation in the space here in the U.S. And there was a big focus also on security. So we've got Eric Geller, who wrote about the 111-page executive order for the messenger, here to talk all about it. Welcome, Eric. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we talk about security, let's maybe just, get some sort of the, standing on the basics here. White House says this is, quote, the most sweeping actions ever taken to protect Americans from the potential risks of AI systems. What are some of these risks that they're calling out here that they're really focusing on? 111 pages is a lot of ground to cover, but what's your thoughts there?
It's a wide range of risks. So we're talking about things like hackers potentially using AI to improve their cyber attacks, which is something that I focused on. But we're also talking about things like protecting the privacy of folks' data when it's getting used to train these algorithms. And we're talking about things like algorithmic bias. So making sure that if you're using AI to recommend medical treatments, that you're training that AI on a wide set of patient experiences so that it's not recommending something that is not going to work for you depending on your ethnicity or something like that. So AI is just now emerging as an issue that, yes, it has a lot of potential, but it could also sow a lot of chaos in a lot of different areas. And one of the things that the executive order tries to do is hit each of those in a different section and talk about how the administration wants different agencies to work on not necessarily solving those problems. I don't think the AIEO contemplates solving all of these problems. What it does address is let's get our hands around the scope of the problem. And from there, we can work with the companies to figure out specific solutions.
Yeah, and this really isn't the first step that we've seen the White House kind of focus its attention on AI in. It was just a year ago that they laid out its AI Bill of Rights. I don't know really what came of that. I'm sure that, probably directly informed what we're seeing here. And like I said, 111 pages, it's no small, little, couple of page memo that has been written up here. What is the size of this? Tell us about how the U.S. government is seeing AI. And I mean, maybe that's even more evolved than it was even a year ago. But what does that tell us?
It tells me that they understand, the folks in the White House understand that this is a problem that is going to crop up on many different fronts. You can't just look at this in the cybersecurity context, although that's kind of what I focused on in my story. Mm-hmm. You also have to look at it in terms of bias. You have to look at it in terms of privacy. There are different sort of permutations of the AI threat. And the EO, again, is trying to say, look, we understand that these problems are going to crop up in multiple different areas. We're trying to kickstart work on each of those areas, but this is just the beginning.
All right. So you've mentioned that you focused largely on the security aspect, which is a piece of this, and we can talk about other pieces here in a second. But let's focus on security to kind of start off with. Plays a very big part of kind of the directive of what we're seeing here. How exactly does this executive order address the use of AI for things like hacks, for exploitation? Does it have any sort of consequence tied into it? Or like you said earlier, is it just really about raising awareness in regards to security?
So it kicks off a pretty ambitious project to get all the different parts of the government that sort of watch over what they call critical infrastructure. So that's our hospitals, that's our power grid, that's our water facilities, and integrate AI security guidance into how they talk to these different companies and say, here's what you need to be doing. Here's how we're going to assess what you're doing. Right now, AI is not a big part of that. This executive order is kicking off a process of integrating AI into that kind of oversight and eventually regulation. We're not there yet, but it will eventually lead to, at different agencies, regulation on, hey, how are you using AI? And also, how are you protecting yourself from AI? So that's one big thing. The other big thing is, when companies test large language models, when they train them, they are going to have to provide reports to the government about the results of their security tests. So most of the major companies have actually voluntarily pledged to the White House, we will test our large language models to see how hackers could exploit them. We will pretend to be hackers. It's called red teaming, and we will try to find problems. And if we find them, we'll fix them. This executive order says, if you do this in the United States of America, you must tell us the results of those tests. And it also, interestingly, requires reporting by the cloud service companies. So think Amazon, think Google. Whenever somebody's buying space on one of these cloud platforms to test these AI systems, which you need to do because they are so computing intensive, if you're buying space to do that, Amazon or Google or whoever has to tell the government, hey, we had a customer sign up because they want to do some AI testing. So that's a way for the government to try to get a sense of how many different people out there are trying to do this, so that, because the first thing, if you want to regulate, you have to understand the space. So these are efforts to try to get their arms around the scope of the activity and then get their arms around the scope of the problem.
From what you just said, it makes me think like the pessimistic view of this is that an AI company can. Let me try and resynthesize. You mentioned if they do these red teaming tests, then they have to share that with the government. Is there any possibility that they just don't do the red teaming test because they don't want to share this kind of information? They'd really probably be shooting themselves in the foot by doing that as well. But is that a possibility here? Or are they saying you must test these things in these ways, and when you do, you have to share that information with us?
It's a really interesting combination of voluntary and mandatory. So the major companies have already promised voluntarily that they will do these tests. And the executive order says you have to share the tests with us. So the Biden administration, the White House, is getting around having to say, we are going to make you do these tests. But only because they've already gotten promises from the major players to do the tests anyway. Now, that doesn't account for that doesn't sort of cover the waterfront of anybody who could do AI research. But right now, because you need so much computing power, the major players represent the vast majority of activity in this space. And at various White House meetings over the past few months, they have committed already to doing those tests.
Is there any limit to, or not limit, but is there any kind of horizon or threshold? There's the word that I'm looking for. Threshold that a company like this has to pass before it's required to do this. In other words, the lower scale entrants in this space versus the really mega ones with, the vast, warehouses full of servers that are driving all of this compute power, are they less likely to fall into these requirements versus like the really big players?
Yes, there are provisions in the executive order that sort of define how big does your activity have to be before you have to report. So it's going to encompass most of what we think about when we think about AI. So training the next version of ChatGPT, that's definitely going to be big enough in terms of the resources that are devoted to it, that OpenAI is going to have to report. And they have, as I said, they were one of the companies that promised to do this voluntarily. So they are going to have to share the results of what they're doing with the White House. So it does encompass pretty much everybody who's doing what we think of as large-scale AI, but there is a threshold that you have to clear in order to be covered by this.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I think companies at that scale, they've been saying for a while, like, yes, come on, regulate us, right? Like we invite regulation, but then there's also, the perspective or the opinion that they're doing that because they can benefit from the regulatory capture. They're already really big. Do you think I guess this is, what do you think versus what do you know, but are we getting any reaction from them about these rules? And do we have any sense of how they actually feel? Like, is this not the kind of regulation they were looking for, if we had to guess?
I think these companies, particularly the major ones that have already made these promises to do this red teaming, they recognize that it's better for their business model to be seen as cooperating with the White House, to be seen as putting their best foot forward. They don't want to get the reputation as the bad guy in the AI ecosystem that is off in the corner doing something secret and who knows how it could be exploited, because that doesn't look good for them as a company that's trying to say, we're out here trying to make society better. And I think the White House has capitalized on that. They understand that these companies, it's not just the technology, it's also the story that they sell. And the White House is saying, hey, if you're selling the story of using AI to make the world a better place, why don't you do these basic common sense things to reduce bias, to reduce security risks? And along the way, we will sort of bring you closer to us and get you more on board for the kinds of regulations that we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. That's positive. What about privacy? Because this, I mean, and by the way, this executive order touches on a whole lot of other angles and aspects of AI than we're going to talk about today. But I think privacy kind of, often is hand in hand with security. What does this address about the privacy of people who interact with AI, about their data, the data sets, that sort of stuff?
So one of the things I think is really interesting in here is the executive order requires every agency to think about how is it buying Americans' personal data from commercial companies, data brokers. So that could be things like the location of your phone based on where it's pinging cell towers. This is something that law enforcement agencies have been doing for years to try to get around warrant requirements for government searches. They just buy your data and they can see where you've gone. Now, when you think about AI and how it can process that data in ways that we've never seen before, that opens up a lot of potential for violating people's privacy because, again, this information was not collected pursuant to the Fourth Amendment. So the executive order says, rethink your purchase of this data, rethink the privacy safeguards that you are putting around this data. Again, this is the kind of thing that is, who knows how it's going to be enforced, who knows how it's going to be implemented. But that's a step by the White House to say, we understand that AI takes things that aren't huge problems already and makes them even bigger, or it takes things that are huge problems and brings them to a scale we've never thought of before. So that's where you see the privacy and AI kind of interact. We've got this data. Right now, we can't make great use of it. Or I should say, previously to AI, we couldn't make great use of it. We're already starting to see agencies use AI to understand it better. And I should say there is a flip side to that, particularly when it comes to cybersecurity. The government is using AI to try to understand cyber threats in a way that humans simply couldn't put those pieces together. So there are benefits as well to that power of AI.
Yeah, no question. No question at all. I totally agree. Eric Geller writes for The Messenger, wrote up a really great piece that we're, of course, obviously talking about right now that you should all go over there and read and understand a little bit more about this executive order. It'll be really interesting to kind of see how this develops, what kind of actual impact this has in the coming months on the companies that we talk about so much in regards to artificial intelligence. So, Eric, thank you so much for taking time today with us. If people want to follow you online, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, or X, I guess I should call it. I'm Eric Geller, and you can find me at ericjgeller.com as well.
Right on. Thank you again, Eric. It's a pleasure. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
All right, bye.